Hi, this is Tim Weber with South Texas College and coming to you with a lecture video on consciousness and the two-track mind, which I'll explain in a bit. So let's get right into that topic then. So first of all, we can distinguish between many different forms of consciousness. Consciousness is generally defined as our awareness of ourselves and our environment. So that takes some expansion, though, to get a handle on. One of the ways to approach this is to consider what we call normal waking consciousness. So that's, the state that we're in when we're just going about everyday tasks. We're all very familiar with that. And consider what you're aware of or can be aware of when you're in this normal waking consciousness state. You can be aware of various sensations, visual sensations, sounds, touch, smell. You also have an awareness of various things in your environment, a chair, a desk, a table, a person, and so on. You can have an awareness then also of movement in your body, as well as awareness of internal sensations like, do I have a stomach ache? And does my foot hurt? And, am I feeling good physically and all that sort of thing. You also have an awareness of what day it is, right? You know roughly what day it is, anyways, and what time of day. Um, you have also some sense of how much time has passed since some previous event that day. You have an awareness of who you are, your identity. You also have an awareness of past events, or you can call many of them to mind, although maybe you can't remember everything that has occurred in the past. You have an awareness of various drive states. Am I hungry or thirsty? You can have an awareness of your an emotional state. Am I happy, angry, sad, and so on. So that's you even notice have an awareness of intentions that you have. And so, if you intend to move your arm, normally we're used to the arm actually moving as we intended. In normal waking consciousness, our arm doesn't just move around without us first intending it. So those are kind of characteristics. Oh, I forgot. We have the capability to engage in our typical powers of reasoning and logic as well, to think about various things and an awareness of our thoughts at that time. So that's all part of normal waking consciousness. Now, we can then, if we think about this concept and what we're capable of being aware of in our waking consciousness, we can compare it with, as they call it, altered states of consciousness that differ in some way from normal waking consciousness. So we have a number of them shown here, although there are probably endless shades of different altered states of consciousness. But let's look at a few examples here. So some of these altered states of consciousness may occur spontaneously. In other words, just kind of seem to happen to us and without any particular intent on our part, such as daydreaming. Now, think about how that's different than normal waking consciousness. When you begin to daydream, your focus of attention is no longer on one thing, but rather your attention drifts from one thing to another. And your awareness of the outer world is less. It fades as you're more aware of those internal daydreams that you're engaging in. Another example is drowsiness, like you see the baby in the picture there, yeah. And so, yeah, you're sitting there 1 minute in class and you're awake, and then you get drowsy, yeah, and maybe you didn't intend to, but once again, your focus of attention is lost. You become less aware of what's going on in your surroundings, and you're sort of your thoughts just begin to fade away, and there you are, you're falling asleep in class, and I've been talking for a while, and as you come out of that drowsy state, you don't have any idea what I said. That's very typical of that. And then another altered state of consciousness, dreaming. Now, talk about an altered state of consciousness. Consider how different this is from normal waking consciousness. In dreaming, you have all kinds of strange things going on, bizarre. If that was happening in normal waking consciousness, yeah, you'd say, oh my gosh, the world is not the way I thought it was. When you're dreaming, you might be engaging in all sorts of actions in the dream, but what's your body doing? It's doing basically nothing, just laying there, right? Maybe a twitch or two, and that's about it. So yeah, um, when you're dreaming, also your normal type of reasoning is often not present. So things can happen that don't make sense, and to you, it's just perfectly fine in the dream. And of course, in dreams, we may actually do things that we wouldn't really be capable of in actuality. So that's really a very different sort of consciousness, as we'll see. Now, we can also look at states of consciousness that are physiologically induced. These altered states would include things such as hallucinations, hallucinations being having a sensory experience without an actual external stimulus. So a hallucination, maybe one hallucinates that there is someone in the room that is not actually there. Maybe one hears voices of people speaking, but there's not really anybody there speaking. You get the idea. So there can be a physical cause for hallucinations. This may be caused by the neurotransmitter metabolism in their brain not functioning properly, physical cause, or maybe by some chemical substance. Maybe somebody, swallowed the wrong kind of mushroom, and that had that effect on their brain to enable them to have hallucinations. Another example is orgasm. So physiologically induced, even though to a great extent, this is psychological as well. But usually there is some physical stimulus that leads to this physical stimulation as well. Or consider food or oxygen starvation. So yeah, think about if you are deprived of food for a significant length of time, if you haven't eaten all day, or maybe haven't even eaten since yesterday, how does that affect your awareness of yourself and your environment? Well, you're aware that your stomach is growling, that you wish to eat something, you have a strong urge to eat something, and if you've ever noticed, if you're really hungry like that, all of a sudden you notice everything that has to do with food. You drive down the expressway and you go, oh my gosh, I didn't know there were so many billboards there for food. And you drive down the street, oh my gosh, I didn't know there were so many restaurants. Well, yeah, because you're focused on that. Now, in fact, sometimes people intentionally decide to not eat for some period of time. Sometimes we'll call that fasting. And when they do, sometimes they again tell us that when they fast, their mental state changes. Maybe they become sharper mentally. Maybe they become more aware of the needs of others when they're deprived of food, or maybe they find that their thoughts shift to more spiritual things after a time of fasting. So again, altering one's awareness physiologically. And then we have some altered states of consciousness that are psychologically induced. Psychological factors come into play, such as those caused by sensory deprivation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Back in the 1970s, psychologists got interested in what would happen if we blocked all of the sensory information that was coming into a person's brain. So they did the best they could to simulate that by putting people in what they called a deprivation tank. So it was this tank filled with salt water so that a person would float and not touching the sides of that tank. They didn't have any touch sensation coming in. The water was body temperature, so they felt neither hot nor cold. And then it was darkened, so there was no visual stimulation coming in. And they would play static over a loudspeaker or headphones so that there was no meaningful auditory stimulation as well. So they then observed the experiences people had when put into this sensory deprivation tank and found that people typically reported that after a fairly short time, they began to be more aware of bodily process that normally would not reach their awareness. They would notice their breathing. They would notice their heart beating. They would have the sensation of the blood circulating throughout their body. They would sense digestive processes going on that they normally would not be able to notice. Given it even more time, extended period of time in the deprivation tank, they reported frequently dream-like states. They weren't actually dreaming, they found out by tracking their brain waves, but it was similar to dreams in fantastical kinds of events going on and so forth, seeming very real, by the way. And I might mention that with dreaming, same thing, that when people are dreaming, those things that are occurring in the dream are not really happening in the real world, but yet they seem so real. But, anyways, sensory deprivation, significant change in awareness. And I should also mention social deprivation. If we're deprived of interactions with other people over time, again, we may get similar effects in the sense that we may actually begin to manufacture other people to interact with. And you see that on that movie Castaway with Tom Hanks. If you've ever seen that, or if you get a chance, watch it. And he's stranded on this island there alone. And eventually he begins to treat this volleyball as if it were another person. And Wilson becomes his best friend. And then the tragic part of the movie, as he's trying to get back to the mainland on a homemade raft, and he loses Wilson, his best friend, and he's just torn up by it. And here it's just a volleyball. But yeah, when we're deprived of social interaction, it can have a very distinct effect on us and change our awareness, even to the point of hallucination. Okay, another example, hypnosis. I'll actually take up hypnosis later in this chapter, so I'm not going to say a lot about it right now, but consider that hypnosis through psychological means by having someone relax and focus intently on some particular stimulus and then making suggestions, we might induce changes in people's awareness. We might suggest to a person that they do not know the number three. And then when asked to count their fingers, they will count 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and be surprised that they now have 6 fingers on one hand. We might suggest that the person not, in fact, experience strong ammonia placed under their nostrils, experience that as a fragrant perfume, and indeed they may, and so on. So there's another change in awareness coming about through psychological means. And then meditation. So meditation gently will involve some intense focus on some stimulus and returning one's awareness to that particular focus when thoughts intrude or when there are distractions to it. People report, experienced meditators report changes in awareness. Some will report that as they meditate, they become more aware of their surroundings. In other cases, less so. In some cases, more aware of their inner states of consciousness, inner states of awareness. And in other cases, less aware of their own individual perceptions. In addition, they have found that people who meditate regularly over an extended period of time also report higher levels of happiness. So there's a change of awareness that goes on with regular meditation, even outside of the meditation time that affects consciousness. Okay, so there's some examples. So consciousness, awareness of ourselves and our environment. Now, what I'm showing you here on this chart is an attempt to diagram consciousness. And maybe you remember from chapter 1, we talked about structuralism in early psychology and how the structuralists wanted to try to diagram the mind. Well, this is what Charles Tart has tried to do here years ago, back in the 1970s. You won't see this in probably any textbook. I happen to be one of Tart's proteges. Was my mentor, and so I've seen a lot of what Tart has done. Um, Tart has actually come up with some very interesting ideas, but some of them not well accepted by other psychologists. Yet he has done some extremely good work that's worth looking into if you're interested in some of the um, more out there kind of stuff. But this is pretty straightforward. So what he's got is he's got awareness in the very center of consciousness here. And then the various subsystems that feed into that awareness. And so we can have here, first of all, we can have feedback that comes to us via the external world, which we call exteroception. And so that sensory information, visual, auditory, touch, and so on, um, makes its way to our awareness, but it does so, first of all, by passing through certain filters. And it's processed there before it reaches our awareness. So that means some of that external information never makes it to our conscious awareness. Other of that information may be altered in some way before it reaches our awareness as well. We also then have the potential of feedback via the body. So internal sensations, interoception. So that would include, our feeling of touch, hot, cold, pain, movement, and so forth. This as well passes through filters before reaching our awareness. Some of it or none of it might reach our awareness. Some of it, again, may be altered before reaching our awareness. Now, that'll become important when we talk about pain and how pain is not a direct sensation of what's happening in our body, but in fact goes through these filters before we become aware of it. Okay. Now, we also have what else playing into our awareness? Memory. So we may remember things from the past and be thinking about them. Our sense of identity, who we are, what our purposes are, what our intentions are. We also have emotions, can be part of our awareness, as well as our space-time sense. Where are we? What day is it? And so forth. And then he has also here the subconscious. Notice that some information coming in, either through our body or from the outside world, may be passed to that subconscious and may or may not reach our awareness. That information that is subconscious also may have an influence on our awareness. Now, that's why he's put a dotted line here. We may not be directly aware of what's going on subconsciously, yet it may influence that awareness that we have at that moment. Now, he also then indicates that what we are aware of then is evaluated, and it is evaluated in different ways by our right and left hemisphere of our brain. This evaluation, in fact, also may be influenced by subconscious factors as well. That evaluation of what we are currently aware of then may result in us doing something. He's called it motor output. So we do something, and notice this again can what produce stimulation either externally or internally, that again goes through the rest of that process there. So notice he's added one thing to the chart that what's this? Latent functions, and there's no arrow to it. Um, Here's what Tart was thinking of, is there might be basic human capacities that we are not fully aware of. So they're not on this chart as specific things or how they might interact with other elements of consciousness. And these functions may or not, may not be developed in a person, and so on. So he's leaving it out there that there may be some other functions that are less familiar to us, yet play a part in this whole awareness consciousness chart. Potentially, maybe what the ability to sense things without the use of our normal sensory apparatus, things that people might say are kind of psychic or something. So Tart held out that there stuff maybe could be possible, but where would you put it on here? I don't know. Anyways, I think that might be useful and kind of get a sense of how consciousness works. Um, okay, let's go on. So let's have a look at the dual processing model of consciousness. So this dual processing model suggests that our brain processes information in two different ways. It processes information at a conscious level that we're aware of, and that's reaching our conscious awareness. It also processes things at an unconscious level that we are not directly aware of. So this would suggest then that consciousness is only a portion of the brain's activity, and that much of the brain's work is actually occurring outside of our awareness. Now, some examples of this. The effects of priming. Okay, so we can show a person a picture of a hare. Okay, hare is what? A type of rabbit. Okay, and then ask them to spell the word hare. Now, if they know that that kind of rabbit, when it's that kind of rabbit, the term hare is spelled H-A-R-E. If they know that and they've seen that picture of a rabbit first, they're more likely to spell it H-A-R-E. So even if they don't know that we just showed them a picture of a rabbit, if we just did that in passing, it affected their choice of spelling. Okay. Um, Implicit memory. So implicit memory is when you can do something, you can do some procedure, but you really don't have a conscious ability to explain how it's done. Now, a good example of that is a friend of mine when I was a kid, and he got one of those Rubik's cubes, one of those cubes that has the different colored squares on it that you can turn them all different directions. And he messed around with it, and he became very good at solving that thing until he could get all of the squares that were one color on one side very rapidly with very few moves. but yet he didn't really know exactly how he did it. He couldn't explain it. That's implicit memory. Okay. So notice that that whole pattern that he was enacting there to solve the puzzle was outside of his conscious awareness. Mm, just about any motor skill that you do involves implicit memory. Serving a volleyball, there's a whole series of movements and various muscles that you activate in a certain order, but you don't know that. You simply run that motor program, implicit memory, and the thing flows from one thing to another, but you sure couldn't describe what muscles you contract and when. You just do it. Okay. Another example that shows the brain's working outside of conscious awareness is what they called automatic prejudice. In experiments, they had people identify objects that were held by people in pictures. And they found out a very interesting thing. People were more likely to misidentify an object as being some sort of weapon if a certain type of person appeared in the picture. Any guesses? It turned out that if the person in the picture was black, they were more likely to misidentify a flashlight as being a knife, or you get the idea. Um, Now, in fact, they had also given these subjects tests of testing for prejudice. And many of them scored low on the tests of prejudice, but yet exhibited this automatic prejudice reaction. And so, even though consciously they didn't have prejudice thoughts, there were still prejudice lurking at an unconscious level. That's really something to think about, these days when we've had so many glaring examples of racial mistreatment and so on, um, and maybe realizing that, yeah, even people that think they've stamped that out, maybe even we ourselves, may still have prejudice that are lurking there below the surface that we still need to work on. Another example, uh, here we have a sudden insight. So maybe you've been trying to solve a problem, remember a person's name, and you just can't do it no matter how hard you think about it. So you give up and you go do something else. And then while you're doing something else, maybe just good while later, all of a sudden that person's name pops into your mind, or the solution to that problem comes to your mind and you weren't even thinking about it. So where did that come from? Well, we would suggest that your brain has been working on that problem or question at an unconscious level outside your awareness. And when the solution was reached, it was brought to your awareness. Then we have the example of creative impulses that some people experience. You might hear the painter that says, the whole scene that I painted just came to me in a flash, or the songwriter that says, the whole song just came to me all at once, fully formed. And what we would suggest is, again, their brain probably was working on that whole work of art at an unconscious level, putting it together, constructing it. And when it was all completed, it was again brought forward to their awareness. So, dual processing. So, our textbook talks about these two ways of processing information as being a high road, which is conscious processing of information at a awareness level, noting that this requires effort on our part, and then referring to unconscious processing as the low road of processing. This being primarily automatic and seemingly effortless, doesn't seem to require effort on our part. Now, I kind of like, I don't know, high road and low road. It seems like it's trying to say one's better than the other. One's not better than the other, they're just different. So how did we learn about some of this? How do we know besides just the whole examples I gave you? Well, more scientific evidence comes from things like the study of DF. DF experienced carbon monoxide poisoning. And after the accident, for as far as she could tell, she was blind. She could not consciously see anything. But her family noticed something kind of interesting. If she was walking down a hallway in the house there, and there were some things left on the floor, she would walk around them, even though she had, as far as she could tell, no visual ability. And so sometimes they call it this blind sight. You know, she was responding to that visual stimulus, but had no conscious awareness of it. And so, what then researchers in studying her found is that indeed this was the case. You know, they brought her into their lab to study her, and she had again no conscious awareness of visual stimuli. Yet they would, put some blocks on the table and ask her to stack the blocks. And of course, she would say, "Well, I don't think I can do it." And they'd say, "Well, just try." And lo and behold, her hand would go to the correct place and close on the block and stack them, no problem. Um, Numerous experiments were done with her that achieved similar results. And so, what they then proposed is, well, she had no visual recognition. There was a visual perception track, um, and this visual perception track, um, normally conscious, was damaged by the carbon monoxide. Okay, so her visual perception tract damaged. There was a separate track for processing visual information that they called the visual action tract. And this is a separate processing, unconscious, that we use to actually manipulate objects. Now, interestingly, they've further found that uh, when we're presented with any object and first see that object, that this visual action track, if it's something that you could pick up, your brain will actually begin to prepare to pick up that object even before you know what that object is, even before you become consciously aware of what you're looking at. So that's this visual action track working with that information at an unconscious level very quickly. So her visual action track was still functioning, and so she could therefore interact with objects. Now, this also is shown when they have people experience this hollow face illusion here. So, looking at the picture, here's what they'll actually show people. That would be this face that is jutting out of that surface. But as people look at that, sometimes they will experience the illusion that it's hollowed out, like you're seeing here. Now, interestingly, if they place a little something on that, let's say they put a little sticker on here, and they ask the person to remove the sticker while they're experiencing the illusion, the person's hand will go to the exact correct place, even though they're not seeing that object correctly. What's happening? Their conscious visual perception tract is experiencing the illusion. It is fooled, but that visual action track is still interpreting the stimulus correctly and causing their hand to go to the correct place rather than the wrong place. So again, we have good evidence that these two different tracks function differently. Now, we also can observe that unconscious processing um, occurs through parallel processing, that we can actually conduct many different mental processes simultaneously at an unconscious level. On the other hand, we can only consciously interpret one bit of information at a time at the conscious level. So we talk about conscious processing as being serial processing, one item at a time. So that suggests also that unconscious processing is a very powerful element of our brain's activity, doing so many things without us even being aware of it. Okay, so let's go on to some attentional phenomenon then. So the first being selective attention. Now, they know that we have some 10,000 bits of information or more bombarding our brain every second. But that's too much to consciously process. We can only consciously process about 40 bits of information a second. So that's a problem. How do we deal with all of that? Well, remember I talked about how there are those filters for that input from our senses that filter that information. Those filters reduce it down to the most important items. And so those are the items then that we place our attention on with selective attention. So selective attention is the ability to focus on some particular stimulus while screening out others, while ignoring other bits of information. Now, this is also related to the cocktail party effect. That's an actual psychological term. And so let's suppose that you're at a party. Um, there is not a quarantine like the pandemic we have now, so there's lots of people crammed into the room having a good time, and you're there with a couple friends having a conversation. So in order to do that, you're actually having to tune out all of the other conversations that are going on around you that may be just as loud, right? That's selective attention. Now, are you actually receiving other information as well? And that would be yes, you are. Indeed, you are processing also other sounds that are in the room, other conversations and so forth. And how we know that? Well, if somebody walks into the room and across the room they call your name, that does register with you. Those filters, noticing that that's important information, allow that information to come through your conscious awareness, and your attention is diverted to that important information that somebody wants your attention. So we see both sides of this actually. Um, Also notice that we may intuitively use information that is processed at an unconscious level. Um, just a quick example of that. In experiments, they had women do math problems, mental math problems, and while they were doing the math problems, they played musical tunes. And these were novel tunes that were specially designed to be things that had not been heard before. And then after they did this portion of the experiment, they played a number of tunes for the women. Some of them were the exact tunes they had heard in the headphones while doing the math problems. Some were novel tunes that they had never heard before. They rated the tunes that they had heard through the headphones higher than the ones that they had never heard before. And that's an interesting effect that they have previously determined, is that people will tend to rate something higher that they'd heard before. And so here again, they had no conscious awareness that they had heard those tunes before, but their opinion of them was influenced at an unconscious level, so that they thought those tunes were better. Okay, so now let's have a look at then the flip side of selective attention, which is inattentional blindness. So I want to show you an example of that. To do that, I'll have to see if I can go to one of our videos from YouTube, and here it is.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Okay, let's rewind. Hey, it's easy to miss something you're not looking for. And yeah, if you still don't believe it, yeah, you could just, go to YouTube and type in moonwalking bear and see that they really did show the moonwalking bear the very first time as well. So it really was there. Okay. So this is what we call inattentional blindness, that we are often do not notice things that we're not attending to directly. So, some typical examples of that. Um, so I go upstairs to look for something and I come back and my wife says, "Oh, did you see my keys up there?" And what do I say? Well, of course not. I was looking for something else, so I wouldn't have noticed them even if they were there, right? When you're looking for one thing, you're not going to notice others. Another very important example of this inattentional blindness occurs, unfortunately, when motorcycle accidents occur. So often the motorist driving the car hit the motorcycle. Often the motorist will say, "I just didn't see them." And you think to yourself, well, how could they not notice them? It might have been, directly in their field of view. Well, in fact, if you have in mind that the only thing that's going to be on the street are cars, and you don't continue to remain aware that, well, there might be motorcycles there, you can actually not see that motorcycle that's on the road because you're just looking for cars. Inattentional blindness. And yeah, that's real. So I just keep that in mind. Okay, there's another form of this that has been termed change blindness, and actually it's a form of inattentional blindness, first studied by Daniel Simmons at the University of Illinois. And what they did in his experiments, they would have a student on the sidewalk who would ask a passerby to help them find something on a map. And as the passerby was trying to help them find that thing on the map, they had some people come by carrying a door. As the door passed and blocked the view of the passerby, they would change out the student for someone else. What happened? Well, here's a reenactment. Let me show you a reenactment of this and then we'll discuss it. Okay, let's see, where is it? Here it is. And here passengers change out somebody else. So the end result is that when asked about this, the passerby often didn't know that there was a different person standing there after the door passed. And sometimes the person was distinctly different, and they changed out notice the things? Well, they were preoccupied with trying to route things on the map. So their attention was on that rather than their surroundings.
Yes, but the
Change
journey was
on
too
the
much.
Yeah, of course they had to debrief any of the passersby afterwards and tell them what had happened, and often they were quite surprised. They didn't almost didn't believe it that they had been fooled, but that's very typical. So let me give you another example of this same phenomenon. This one is really fun.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Sorry, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Did you notice the 21 changes? Yes.
Action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
Yeah, so how many changes did you notice? I know when I watched this the first time, I maybe noticed one thing. I think I noticed they changed the bear to the suit of armor or whatever that was. But yeah, so this is very typical. Again, while we're focusing on one thing, we don't notice changes in some other area. Okay, let me give you an example of that from. Okay, I hope.
To test just how much attention the attention-stealing design of the new Skoda Fabia actually steals, we left one parked on this ordinary road in West London.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I don't know what happened, but let's get rid of that and get back to. Okay, so here's an example of change blindness, and maybe some of you actually experienced this one. Let's say you go to buy a car dealership, and so you find a car you like, and they get the whole deal going, and you like the price on it and everything, and they come with the contract. You're going to finance the car, and you look at the payments and you say, I'm sorry, I just can't do it. That payment is just too high. And so the salesperson says, well, okay, let me go talk to my manager. Let me see if I can get them maybe they can get the payment down for you. And so they go on their way. And by the way, I always wondered, what do they actually do when they go to do this? You know, I have an idea. They just sit in the back room and, smoke cigarettes and watch TV or something for a while, because they sure seem to take a long time. But anyways, let's say he finally comes back or she comes back, and you look at the contract again, and oh, good, the payments. Yeah, the payment is now within reach. And so you sign the contract, take the car, and later on you look the contract over and realize that one of the things that they did while they were back there, yes, they lowered the payment, but they cranked up the interest rate and you didn't notice it. Why? Because you were focused on just the payment and you didn't really look at those other things. And so change blindness can sometimes kind of hurt. Anyways, so those are the few of these phenomena. The next one we're going to look at by the way, I'll put this outline up on Blackboard for you. There's a few other examples that you can hit. If you click on these, you should be able to see a few other examples. Let's go to the topic of divided attention. So divided attention is where we attempt to divide our attention between two or more tasks. Now, it's not really possible because as they have studied how our attention works, they have learned that we really can't attend to more than one thing at a time. So when we're doing divided attention, what a lot of us call multitasking, what we're really doing is bouncing rapidly back and forth between tasks. But at any moment, our task is really only on one of those things. And so, what is the effect of trying to divide our attention between multiple tasks? That's what this demonstration is designed to show you. So, in order to participate, you need someone else. Okay, so in a moment, stop the video, find somebody else to participate with you. If you can find several people, so much the better. You can divide into two groups, but even if you just have yourself and another individual, one of you can be group one and one can be group two. So once you get your people gathered, oh, and by the way, if we're still in the pandemic when you watch this, make sure that you practice social distancing and the use of a mask if they're outside of your household and so on, to be safe. But anyways, okay, so you got your people there for it. Here's what you do now, okay? Once I start the demonstration, the person or persons who are group one are to look at the screen and look at the names of cities, count the city names that are in red. So count the cities that appear in red. And group one also has the task of also raising their hand whenever they hear the sound. Now, what's the sound? Let me hit this thing. Hold on to your hats. It might be too loud. Okay, there it is. So that's the sound, all right? So turn it down if it's too scary, all right? All right, so group one, gonna count the cities in red, raise their hand quick as they can when they hear the sound. Group two, okay, or person two, is going to look at group one, or group one person, and also raise their hand as fast as they can when they hear the sound as well. Okay, so a little contest on how fast you can raise your hand. Group one is going to be counting the cities in red. So you ready? Group two, you should be looking at group one, and here we go. Okay, so that's it. Now, let me ask you, what were your results? Okay, if you were group two, what did you observe about group one's performance? Okay, when we do this in the classroom and we have numerous people, group two will say, group one didn't raise their hand as promptly, as quickly as we did. They will also note that, well, sometimes those people in group one, they raised their hand even when there wasn't a sound. Um, or sometimes they didn't raise it when there was the sound, whereas we were pretty good at it, too, we'll say. Right? So what's going on there? Group one is trying to multitask, is trying to divide their attention, and the effect of that is they will make more errors. Okay, they will make more errors, and they will also respond to important stimuli more slowly. Now, just to give you a chance to reverse it and see if that was just a matter of individual differences, let's reverse it. Person one becomes person two, group one becomes group two, and vice versa. So once again, group one or person one is this time going to simply watch number two and raise their hand as fast as they can. Number two this time is going to count the cities in red and raise their hand as quickly as they can as well. And by the way, we'll ask both groups at the end how many cities there were in red. Okay, so make sure you count them if you're number two this time. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so how did that turn out? Once again, you may have noticed that group two, who is now counting the cities in red and multitasking, probably responded more slowly to the sounds, raised their hand later, delayed response, and maybe made errors in raising their hand. That would be very typical, and we always see that when we do that with a group. So to sum up, multitasking, divided attention results in more errors being made and slows responses. So that becomes important in certain situations where making the proper response quickly and promptly can be life or death, such as driving a car. And they have determined, yes, that in fact being preoccupied with a phone conversation while driving does slow responses to changes in the roadway, and people do make more errors. They've tested this using driving simulators, and essentially they found carrying on a cell phone conversation while driving pretty much equal to being legally drunk. And that's even if you are having a hands-free conversation. They think the reason for this is that, well, your attention is on that conversation, and so you experience all the effects of divided attention. You say, well, why is the same thing not true of having a conversation with someone who's in the car with you? Well, because usually if someone is in the car with you, if something happens in the road ahead, they'll stop talking and you will be able to shift your attention to it and take care of it. So that's not as dangerous as a cell phone conversation. But yes, divided attention. You might also consider, a lot of times people will try to divide their attention while studying. They'll try to, watch a TV program and study, or watch a ball game and study, and so on. Well, what you're really doing is shifting back and forth. So you're probably not getting near as much studying done as you think. And you probably are also incorporating more errors in your thinking as you try to multitask and study at the same time as well. So it's recommended that when you study, you just focus on that and nothing else. Okay, so that brings us then to sleep and dreams, which will make up part 2 of this series on consciousness. So we'll stop there. That's plenty long. And so have a great day. See you on the next segment.